ready.
Welcome to Pacific Unitarian Universalist Church. We're a beacon of hope in the South Bay. Before we even begin with any announcements, we do have to just mention that LA and cities around the country are facing a turmoil we've faced in the 60s and the 90s here over and over again. It's a tragedy. I'm going to try to keep it together. George Floyd, as we know, handcuffed, murdered. Not long before him, Ahmaud Arbery. It's a sad place to be, that it's a dangerous thing to be a black person, particularly a dark black man in America. And we also know that robbing stores and burning things is hardly any kind of solution, but it's tragic that that seems to be what demands and draws attention. So today's sermon on God, which is what it is, will be sort of tainted by that, and hopefully we can incorporate that. This has all happened fairly quickly. So we'll light a candle for George and for injustice and for justice and all those clumsy ways we do that. So today's service is about God. There's a few announcements. We have a congregational meeting at noon today after it's been listed at 12:30, but we're going to start it at noon. The 3 o'clock Zoom meeting, which we think of as Vivian's Zoom meeting, which is going to be at 1 next week, is held back from that move for one more week because of the congregational meeting. We didn't want it to interfere with that space. Next Saturday, Building Your Own Theology will take place at 10. We're going to see an upgraded level of probably limited to Zoom meetings, but our RE programs, many of the younger kids in particular, have not gathered, and we need to make that happen. So that's happening soon. We're going to start back at church unless something changes in the way we've planned things on August 9th, which gives us a little bit more quarantine time, and we think that's a decent balance. That's the first day I'm back from Boston for a bit. We're going to start adult ed group meetings on the third week of September, kind of our natural time. RE starts back in the fall, so we can think about regathering them, provided all goes reasonably well. On Tuesday morning at not 10 but 11, there's going to be, I'll do my Zoom call. We're going to move that to 11 because there's a book group that interferes with that, so keep that in mind. There we go. There's announcements. So today, with the theme of God picked by what I think of as Vivian's Zoom call, the 3 o'clock call, I was instinctively trying to give a more dynamic nature to our choices, and I asked that group to pick the topic just for fun, and pretty quickly they picked God, but more specifically a UU understanding of God, which I thought was cool. God is a big enough topic, and if you don't think that there's meat on the bone even for us UUs and many atheists in the room, you're wrong. And the interesting thing about that was, quite serendipitously, Vivian and I went to the same place for research instinctively, so there's a commonality there. And we all know that God is a gift and a tease and a question we can never answer and a question we can never seem to put down either. So in theological terms, God is the theological first source of physics and a deeper meaning for people, and we're going to discuss that in a UU context today. So, but before that, I'm going to invite our very own Jean Tordella, who's going to come forward and read our chalice words while I light it.
In This Time of Uncertainty by Amy Williams Clark. We gather in this time of uncertainty, full of unknowns, as angst closes in upon us. We light this chalice with a flame that draws us together. With this flame, we cut through the darkness of isolation and are warmed by the fires of our interconnection. For this moment, this radical moment, we find a certainty within the knowledgeable bonds of love and community.
That's our very own PUC choir doing what they can and learning songs. We're building up a repertoire on Zoom, and we're going to have kind of a catalog of choir songs. When we come back on the 9th, because singing has been discovered to be such a dangerous way of spreading the COVID, we're going to not come back singing, which is its own sadness, but we're going to have a better visual system. We're getting a fancy camera system, and we'll be able to be more technological than we are at the moment. We're not going to have our president spinning his iPhone around to film me and everyone else, which we're grateful that he does. I'd like to gather the children forward. I hope you've lit your own home chalice if you have one, and I'd like the kids to come forward. We'll talk about the most difficult topic there is to talk about, really, and that's God. So when you're a kid, there's a general sense that adults kind of know stuff that you don't, right? I mean, they just do because they do. But when it comes to God, you should know that adults don't know really much of anything at all. That's the funny part about it, right? So we fumble around. There are people who have very deep experiences connected to God. There are people who don't believe in God. Some of the people who believe the strongest things about God and believe in God the most do horrific things. Some of the people who don't believe in God at all do wonderful things. It's a weird mix of things. But I thought that I would just use this time to sort of express all the ways humans see God in a very physical way, in no particular order, right? We have seen God as expressions in animals, particularly certain animals, like doves are thought of as being like the messengers of God. Generally, sweet kind of animals that we like lambs are thought of as a God image. Around the world, people don't necessarily always identify with one God, but they have different things that are meaningful to us. Like, I think of this is an Asian image, and we think of this as being someone meditating and enlightened, right? So the path to God is through a level of cognitive and spiritual growth that brings us closer to the heavens, even in a framework where there isn't one particular personality that is the source of all of that. So if you're confused, you're paying attention. Sometimes people see God as being contained in buildings. That is a Japanese temple, and in theory, temples and churches and synagogues and mosques and all of that are places where God kind of lives, right? God also lives in nature, particularly in sort of strange phenomenon that we can hardly explain but sort of mesmerize us, like in rocks, when you see different colored tears in rocks. That brings us closer to God and the sense of wonder that we attach to God as well. Other majestic natural things like quartz and minerals grab our attention too, and we sort of think, wow, that's wondrous, and we attribute it to God or we don't, but we are mesmerized and moved. Look into that. cool is that, right? Most often we think of instinctively, because we've been trained to think this way, that God is a man. But God is captured in the images of women, particularly around fertility and the nurturing capacities, right? In the Christian sense, Jesus' mother is very important, Mary in many traditions, so we want to embrace that God is captured in women and men, even if God is invisible and may not even exist. We have to come up with images to capture what's holy. Sometimes people write amazing words, like these words here. Simple. Around the world, people now read these in English. God grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, and the courage to change the things I can, and the wisdom to know the difference. Nobody particularly thinks God wrote that, but we do tend to think that the feeling that that creates is inspired by God, right? Or is inspired by the best of us. So that has a godly quality to it too. Again, in nature, in the way that things are ordered, there is a certain uniformity, right? There's order in the universe. Let's take a look at this plant and the structure that it has. People see God in the order of the universe, that things tend to make sense, right? Some people think some sounds are holier than others, right? I want you to imagine the scratching of a blackboard. Maybe you guys don't have that even. You're young enough not to hear too many blackboards. But if you do, or the screeching of a cat screaming, and then this beautiful sounds like we utter every Sunday. Kind of peaceful, isn't it? And then some people meditate with the idea of, oh, and a biological kind of magical way that brings us to a deeper space. Maybe some people would say to God's space. Some people see God as captured in totems and in the combination of animals and different images. This is a sort of shorter version of a Native American totem. I'll pull it forward a little bit. And people think that these images that they've created in them is captured some of the power of spirits or of God, him or herself. We also think about hearts, right? Probably the way that most of us, more often than not, feel what we would say is God is in our hearts, right? And here is Jim, one of our own, and his granddaughter in a heart. And we put them in our hearts because there's depth there. That's kind of where we center what we think of as our feeling, right? You say that person has a lot of heart, or I love you. We think of our hearts. If God exists, God kind of lives in our hearts somewhere there. And then, of course, just to pick a classic Christian image, this is a cross, and people find this a sacred path to God. Maybe not God. We think of it as a symbol, but we think of that symbol can take us to a deeper place. So God is about depth sometimes, right, which is kind of down, and God is also thought of as heights. We don't know what we're talking about with God, but we want as many experiences in our lives, I think, that bring us to God and make us feel godly as possible. That really is somewhat shared, that we want these meaningful experiences. So, as UUs, we're not quite so much concerned about whether you get the phrases right as much as we create kind people who are in their own way in touch with what they feel is meaningful. That's really what this church is about, and people get there in a whole bunch of different ways. So, I thank you for that, and we're now going to hear we're going to do joys and concerns followed by our prayer. And this week, kids, if you're still there in front of the computer, we had a tragedy. You've probably seen it on TV. We have a pandemic going on. We also have divisions attached to our country in terms of race and power and policing, and that is its own problem, and nobody that I know of thinks God is attached to the way we treat each other so violently. So I'm lighting a candle for George Floyd, and for our own Val Carenza Pack, who's home not well, fighting something. She doesn't know what it is. And I light that candle for our folks and for all those joys that remain unsaid. Jean?
Apart but Together by Cynthia Landrum. Spirit of love, we gather together in different ways this morning, from computer screens, from telephones, from car radios. We gather reaching out across the wires, waving from a safe distance, to come together in religious community. From living room to front porch to car seat, we gather as we are able, ready to be of service to each other, to the world, ready to build the community of hope and of love. As we face this bright morning, we are apart, but we are together, offering our love, our commitment, our hope, and our prayers in service to one another and this world, in a new way, but an old way, that we come together and worship today.
For George Floyd. Hatred has no place in my heart. Hatred has no place in my heart. Hatred has no place. Hatred has no place. Hatred has no place in my heart. Hatred has no place in this town. Hatred has no place in this town. Hatred has no place. Hatred has no place. Hatred has no place in this town. Hatred has no place in my heart. Hatred has no place in my heart. Hatred has no place. Hatred has no place. Hatred has no place in my heart.
Thank you, Severin. Gary's going to focus in on a painting that Sue Cutler donated to us to liven up our Zoom services here, or our Facebook services, I should say. And so we're grateful to Sue for thinking of that, and we're trying to be as dynamic as we can be on our, what I call TV church. So hang in there with us. We'll be back together, and we're going to be better at this, every day. As I mentioned in the newsletter, this is the sermon. The Zoom call today came up with the topic of what is God for you use, chosen about a month ago, actually. And I want to thank him for a prompt that has turned into a 3-part series. So you're going to get that in the next 2 weeks as well. So although our Zoomers asked for one service, I figured given humans have been thinking about a singular God figure for about 5,000 years, I could spend 3 weeks on it. Even for UUs, God is hardly a novel topic for a sermon series. But to say more generic talk for next week, I'm going to talk about God in a different sense, in a more theatrical sense next week, and then the week following that I'm going to do a little bit of the history of how we've thought of God in an evolutionary way with Karen Armstrong and another author. Since the actual choice for the topic today was not God, but how UUs view God, I'm going to focus in a minute on on a group of theologians that are on the website, and Gabby's going to place up that link for us. You can tune to that later, or even while you're listening to it. When we mention God, we don't even know really whether we're talking about, we haven't clarified at least theologically, whether we're talking about a personality, a topic, or a concept. We have an agreement as a church, strange as this may be, of whether God is a noun, a verb, real, or entirely the product of our imagination. A slightly uncomfortable chuckle here would be appropriate. Mostly we avoid talking directly about God by getting our inner spiritual poet on and using phrases we can all sort of be not offended by, such as spirit of life, and some of these are beautiful and poetic. In regards, though, for Unitarian Universalists, in terms of clarity, we're a thoughtful mess when it comes to God. A theological car crash, I've thought of describing it as, where no one agrees on what has happened or who's responsible. You should be smiling. We UUs agree on a lot. Culturally, we're pretty homogeneous in a way. We agree on everything but religion. Nonetheless, God remains important, and God remains an integral part of the way we answer questions, even if we answer that God is not a part of those. Our deepest questions, our deepest heart generally turns us to the question of God. Think about it. Whether you or we feel like we're playing to an audience at all, a cosmic audience, that's a God question. Whether we think about whether we're loved beyond the immediate earthly way we feel we are, God question. I don't want to be falsely dramatic, but God matters immensely, even to atheists. For UUs, the place where inspiration meets complexity and inspiration meets doubt is probably the most common place we live. We live in that enigma. And we do so because we simply think too much for God to be simple and be carried by simple vehicles to us. And for being a part of that movement, I'm both proud and a bit sad. I wonder if you agree and feel that way. I suspect that you might. By saying that we don't have a clear view of God makes for a very unsatisfying and short sermon, however, even if it does answer the Zoom caller's request. So when Vivian sent out the link to the UU colleagues who've answered called Views on God, and I had chosen that sort of on my own, I thought I would use it. So what I'm going to walk through is a handful of what my colleagues in the UU world have said. And that UUA website is a great sample and really worth a look. I was moved by it. From our own Zoom callers, we had a lot of great theology, and from the colleagues who you expect theology from, we had a lot of heart. It was a great balance. We'll start with Paul Razor, who is one of the more respected theologians of our movement and the modern moment. I want to begin running through what he suggests the God UUs would be talking about when we use that word. Reverend Razor says, Unitarian Universalists and other religious liberals have conceptions of God that range across a wide spectrum. Some reject God altogether and hold a strictly atheistic view of the universe, and others who are not atheists may use God to convey, I think of them as about four things. One is the creative power of evolution in the universe. The other is the power that works to make transformations in our lives possible. It is that lure to the better. One is the ongoing power of love, as he describes it, and it also in his words, simply the ultimate mystery within which we all must live. Four kind of job descriptions or categories of God. And I think that's a good summary of the God that we debate about existing, what they would do. One more time, just to hear it in my words this time. This is Razor conceives of a God possible for UUs and modern thinkers as the original creative power initiating and possibly guiding the universe. Think of this as the creator God. And or the motivating reason and energy that prompts people to be better, to transform themselves. Likewise, similar but a little bit different, God is also possibly the source that would be behind our deepest feelings like love and justice. And God may be the word we use to describe the magic and the mystery that is in life and self. If God exists, God does some or all of those things. UUs refer to God as the creator, the Lord too, and the source of the good, and to describe the mystery of life. I do want to stop and assure you that when we're approaching the question of God, we're most surely not talking about the God that we would propose imagining living on a throne. I don't know any UUs who would defend the real existence of that God. Likewise, very few UUs, or if any, would describe God as the authoritative author of Scripture without human intervention. Hardly any UUs believe that the Bible or the Quran or any piece of spiritual literature comes directly from God in an unfiltered human way. We know that if God exists, God is filtered through human experience. That doesn't mean that the notions of God we have in our head, particularly that idea of a regal God with a personality, doesn't slide in behind our deeper cognitive beliefs sometimes. We know that it does. And we know that mostly that means a he in our minds. UUs are aware of how sneaky ideas are at getting in behind even what we think of as being more rational. It's a very important UU concept. And God is sneaky like that, as in every idea of the divine. We are as a rule, very self-reflective about how we think and understand anyone's subjectivity on the divine matters a lot. We are in all our religious views more than we generally like to admit. Although none of the UU theologians in our survey think of or describe God as a woman, we're aware of the power of imagery that imagery has in creating the divine. So a lot of images have been introduced back into our world around goddess and motherhood, particularly also around race. We now imagine God in different colors as an effort to get out of our paradigms that we've lived in before. Most UUs are open, as Paul describes it, to an invocation, these are his words, an invocation of God as imagery and using metaphors such as mother or sister in place of the traditional images of father or Lord. But beyond an awareness of gender or race, UUs are aware that we're capable of also having a relationship to something that may not even exist. Think about that. That's very possible as well. Or a God that exists but isn't accessible to us. Push our flexibility even further. UUs differ on the question of how accessible that God would be and what type of relationship we have of having that God. Those are Razor's words. We're very aware that different people and cultures speak of God at different times. If you're a UU, you know this, it's almost redundant. For not everyone listening to us is, though. In short, we know that there's a lot of subjectivity in what we say about God. There's a lot of our own autobiography in what anyone says God is. This awareness of this truth is a lot of the reason why we refuse to make speculative claims. This is, again, where you chuckle because as a religion, we're not going to make statements on religion. We're smart enough to know that both talking about God is like trying to wrap water into a newspaper. But what else can we do? Whether God is real or imagined, our chief concern is not, as UUs, for God's feelings as a rule. What matters for us mostly, generally, is how God affects or effects our spirits. Summarized more simply, most UUs have the orientation that we're not here necessarily for God's benefit. How we relate to God has more to do with how we behave or for our benefit. Not everyone would say that, but that's generally true. Spirituality is for us more than it is an appeal to a God that we live under, as a general rule. This self-reflective, this very broad-minded approach to religion is our greatest advantage and our greatest disadvantage theologically. It's the root of why we're so committed to tolerance and why we're such a clumsy theological mess. With no answers evident and the stakes so high, being a flexible mess is the best approach to theology. Our own administrator, Gabby, is nodding her head at me. She lives with me. She knows what a theological mess I am. And our journey has taken us from being non-Trinitarian Christians at our start to transcendentalists who didn't really like the name God and chose Oversoul, another rephrasing or rebranding of God. We became abolitionists, very concerned about the issue of slavery, women's rights. We then became humanists largely in the early 20th century. And now we are religiously about anything you can be and say as long as you're thoughtful and polite society. Maybe in a few others over the boundaries too. So I promise a tour of UU theologians on our website, and you'll hear them in their own words now. Our view of God, we're going to hear how it's a subjective matter. We're going to hear the potential for a holy and mystical relationship as one of our UU colleagues speaks of it. We're going to hear about how our freedom as moral agents, freer than in other traditions, gives us a demand that we engage in the fight for justice, and how God as an image can lift us up and redeem us in a very traditional way, and how God can be destructive and oppressive, and all that. Now then, Scotty McLennan, who's the former Universalist chaplain at Tufts. He is also, interestingly enough, the image for the minister character in Doonesbury. He was the roommate of Gary Trudeau at Tufts. McLennan says, as a young child, I thought of God as a magical, all-powerful being who was responsible for everything that happened, good or bad. Later in childhood, I began to feel I had a cause and effect relationship with God, right? This is gaining his favor or not his favor by how I petitioned and behaved and prayed. McLennan says, in my teenage years, God became personalized for me as the ideal parent, accepting and loving. By the time I was in my 20s, God had become an impersonal force and energy in the universe. How many of us have walked some version of that journey? Likewise, Eric Walker Wickstrom, who's the parish minister of First Universalist Church in Yarmouth, Maine, he echoes that developmental philosophy from McLennan and the shifting notion. He says very similarly, when I was young, I believed in a personal God, a person who, although invisible, would probably look like one of Michelangelo's paintings. As I grew older, I came to believe in an impersonal God, a force like gravity or love itself. A lot of us have walked those journeys. We know how personal and how frequently we've come to incorporate a varied sense of how people view God into our subjectivity. We also know how people have incorporated it from their own historical context and from their own cultural context. McLennan closes his piece on God, stating that even I know that intellectually God is an impersonal force. I often feel overcome by the Spirit that from a source that comes from far away and is beyond my conscious control. I love that. Despite all our reason, we have experiences of God sneaking in and causing us to feel and transform us. Whether that comes from God or not, we don't know, but those experiences are often attributed to God. Not all of us live in enigma, right? Some of us, in a religion where we rarely let things get out of hand and then bemoan that we never go to church and things get out of hand, we have a small mystical side represented in the past by George de Benneville, who's an interesting mystic, came from France. But today I like to think of Kate Lohr, who's the minister of the Quimper Universalist Church, a Unitarian Universalist Church in Washington, and I did social justice stuff with her about 10 years ago. She's a dedicated and buoyant soul, and she represents that important truth that we generally approach theology with critical minds and have often kill off some of the magic. She has it in spades. Let's hear from her. Reverend Lohr does not sound ambiguous when she says in a relationship with God that she considers herself to be both a Unitarian Universalist and a Christian mystic. Kate says, my faith is pretty simple and pretty rock solid. It feeds my soul. It is the source of joy, and it colors all that I do. I experience God as love, light, power, and wisdom. The God I pray to is both transcendent and eminent, right here and above and beyond. She says, I experience as a God as a light that comes to me in the darkness, and a light emanates intense love and compassion, leaving me feeling joyous and connected to all of creation. I'm a little jealous. I get a little of that. I feel that sometimes. In a tradition more comfortable with debate, though, than revelation or faith, Kate says, I'm usually shy about sharing my experiences with God because I can't explain God in an intellectual manner. I experience the sacred through my heart. But when I try to define it with words, those words fall short of the experience. Such is the mystery, she closes her piece with. Kate captures that talking about God is impossible, and the harder you try, the clumsier it gets. I love that. She's a great person. Although an actively, seemingly personal relationship with God is within our UU framework, generally, the approach is less personal and phrased in more scientific ways. Kathy Huff, the associate minister of the First Parish Church in Arlington, Mass., next to my hometown back east, represents this instinct to incorporate new truths and paradigms when she speaks of the divine this way. She says, it is not a singular personality for me, but a network of relationships. Kate says, long before I knew anything about physics, I sensed that life was woven together by invisible threads of being, and that the earth and all that lies beyond it emanate from not one source, but a complex web of existence and energy that spans space and time. Well, that's a mouthful, I know. It's also beautiful, and it speaks to our complexity as theologians. She goes on, and while I believe there's a conscious connection between and interdependent relationships between this web of existence, I don't use God or goddess to describe that. Kathy articulates the kind of spiritual outlook that drove us to add the seventh principle about interdependence to our set of principles. Voted on quickly and immediately. Spontaneously, we get the interdependence of things. Reverend Huff, like many UUs, constructively embraced the freedom that this comes for her. She suggests that this leads us to be an amoral, godless universe, but the universe I experience, although it has no moral aspect, she is driven to produce justice from that. She says that everything I do, think, say, and feel relates to everything else and may have consequences and meaning beyond my comprehension. The classic ripple effect, right? I'm sure that right now Judy Carter, a scientist, is swooning over Kate's ecologically themed spirituality. Me too. Kathy talks personally and profoundly about a connection between the moral liberty that we have as independent creatures, maybe more than in any other tradition, and the responsibility that that brings. Essentially, mostly we UUs believe ourselves to be the arbiters of ethics and morality. Essentially, whether driven by their faith in God or by their lack of faith in God, UUs feel a higher degree of moral responsibility for themselves and for others. We're sort of more generally responsible than faithful. Not everybody sees the images of physics and those interconnections as enough, though, right? We understand that. As much as we're wooed by Kate Lore's mystical instincts and the beauty of that, and as much as we might be enamored with Kathy's ability to talk about interconnection, some of us are in contexts where we need the power of God in a traditional way to lift us up. Although we're generally much less about redemption than other traditions, our theologians on the front lines of hope might be acquainted with the power of the traditional God that God brings. Lisa Schwartz, a chaplain in substance abuse recovery in Topeka, Kansas, lifts up the belief in her quote, "No theology is universal," and that, this is me, that theology is universal and is more akin to autobiography than rational speculation. She talks about this in this way. She says that the Christian story is unique in her upbringing, and it's also unique in her role as a chaplain. She talks about the ministry and the image of Jesus as being a metaphor that's clumsy intellectually, but for personal renewal and redemption, it's hard to beat, she says. As a literal tale of Jesus' resurrection, it's hard to sustain, but as a metaphor that illustrates there is life beyond addiction and despair and what feels like total loss. The resurrection is hard to beat. She's right. Part of our relationship with God or not is to call us to be a better self. I feel that all the time. I don't believe in the God of my childhood. I don't really believe that there's a God exists, but I do believe that God calls me to be a better person, and I don't want to lose that by being too intellectual sometimes. Lisa Schwartz, the chaplain in recovery in Kansas, credits that transformational power of God as being powerful. However, God's images in the world, as Anthony Pinn suggests, who's a theologian and a professor at Macalester College, says can be oppressive. Think about this flip. This is all within our tradition. Professor Pinn speaks words many UUs could shout an amen to. In his piece for the UUA website, he utters that it's been years since he's been able to use the word God to explain anything about the world that we live in. For Anthony, his resistance to the concept of God is rooted in how persistently God has been used to justify suffering. Think about it in the context of this week. In the professor's simple words, the issue of evil and suffering prevents me from finding any comfort in the term God. He says this is particularly true when I consider the history and the current needs of the African American community. Pinn speaks for many UU atheists when he suggests that the experience of faith in God has for far too long justified suffering by seeing it as redemptive and allowing that to be a source of oppression, or at least sustaining oppression, as if there's something edifying about the punishment of a people. We must never forget in the UU churches, atheists get their moment at the microphone as well. So to offer the quickest summaries of what we've talked about, and this is quick, UUs both believe in and don't believe in God. UUs both believe in believing in God and don't believe in God, believing in God. You might have noticed that none of the voices encourage us to believe that we can believe whatever we want. If nothing is theologically clear about our faith, one thing is clear. We believe that what we think matters. And it matters because it makes us behave in different ways. That is pretty universally shared. And that makes for things that are not simple to explain. This is where I get a little righteous. But for all that's embraced in our movement, what is not embraced is a nihilism and a dogmatism that suggests uttering phrases and simply giving up is an acceptable approach. If that's where you're at, I think we would generally agree that you have spiritually failed and it's time to renew your view of what your role is in the world. Saying again what I said in the intro, we're a funny bunch. Our religion is willing to take positions on everything. Ask yourself, positions on gay marriage, for it. Positions on racism, overtly against it. When faced with the public choice between ecological concerns over profit, we side with the planet. It's us in the pandemic, it's mostly masks over the personal freedom issue. And if we have a political process in our way of going about things that allows us to take a position on every cultural issue there is, and we generally have. However, ask us, a church, about God, and like one of the president's friends forced to testify in court, we formally lose our voice and go silent. Because of our commitment to understanding that we all have a different path, we go silent on the question of God in a formal way. I chuckle every time I think it. You should too. We deserve a little friendly mocking for that position, to make definitive statements about God, but really, that's where we've evolved to, and it works for us. That is who and where we are. You can see where you are on that continuum. Next week, more on God. Exactly how it's going to come out, I don't know. Time for our offertory. Time for you to dig into your credit card, and there you are. So there's a person, and he's at church, gets up, walks out of the church. At the end of the church service, the woman walks up to the pastor and says, "I'm so sorry, sir. I hope you're not offended at all by my husband's behavior walking out of the church. The truth is, since his very youth, he has been a sleepwalker." Give generously.
Just a quick note, today's 3 o'clock Zoom discussion will be led by Mary Ann Stein. She wants us to know that will be about the empathy effect. If you are observing us today with someone, please hold hands and remember, this church is dedicated to the proposition that behind all of our differences, beneath all of our diversity, there is a unity that makes us one and binds us forever together, in spite of time and death and the space between the stars. We pause in silent witness to that unity.
May the blessing of love be upon you. May love's peace abide with you. May love's presence illuminate your hearts now and forevermore. So be it. Amen. Shalom. Salam. Namaste. Blessed be. And now our service truly begins.